Welcome to Theology 102. What we're going to do in this session is to dig in a little deeper from what we talked about last October in Theology Proper 101. Now, Theology Proper is a study of God's nature, His attributes, who He is, what He's done, and what He's revealed about Himself. That's distinguished from theology, which is kind of often used to describe all of the doctrines. Theology Proper is God's nature. So it is a study of God. And if you want a summary of what we talked about last October, you can look at the other video, the 5-minute summary of that. But what we're going to do is we're going to dive in, and we are going to try to address one main question, which is, why don't people worship God? Because when God reveals things about Himself to us, that's not so that we can feel smarter about ourselves. It's not so that we can pass some test. It's largely so that we can understand who God is, and we can then turn our worship toward Him in response. But there are a lot of people who don't worship God. So the question is, why? Why aren't there more worshipers when people have all this information about God, particularly what's available to them in the Word? So what we're going to do is we're going to break this session down into 5 different, what we're going to call heretical assertions. And we're going to state them in this way. I can't worship a God who would, fill in the blank. The way that I'd encourage you guys to use this, if you're watching or listening to this on your own, is to use, and this will be in the email as well. You can find it in either the link on this YouTube or in the email. You're going to find a PDF. And what it's going to be is a list of all the different attributes of God that we've studied, that we've talked about. And I want you to use that as a reference point. And then as you hear these heretical assertions, as you hear statements that people would make that they can't worship God because of these things, the ultimate question in each of these little mini sessions is going to be, well, which of God's attributes addresses this kind of a question or this kind of an assertion? In other words, what do we need to know about God that helps us to turn from a position of declaring that we can't worship Him because of this dilemma that we're experiencing, to instead understanding God better and realizing that our worship of Him can be even more passionate, more zealous, more responsive to what He's told us about Himself. So what I'd encourage you to do is, if you're doing this as a group, listen to each of these 5, pause the video, then go and check out that document and look over the list of the attributes and try to talk amongst yourselves and ask which of God's attributes would help us to understand why we experience this dilemma the way that we do. I'm not going to answer those in this. So if you're doing this on your own, trying to prepare for group, maybe have that little list out and jot yourself some notes. But what we're primarily trying to do in this video is to help you guys have a more robust discussion together, whether you're doing this on your own for a future discussion or whether you're doing this together in group. So let's get started. Heretical assertion number 1. I can't worship a God who would allow unspeakable evil in His world. Now, that may be an assertion you've wondered about, maybe one you've made, but more than likely, it's definitely one that you've heard. This is often used in reference to things that can be personal tragedy, like a loss, or evil that's been personally experienced, like a rape, or something that you just know of anecdotally, like obviously one of those situations, or on a more mass scale, something like a genocide. The question, though, and more than just a question, is the assertion. God can't be worthy of worship if He would allow that kind of thing to exist in His good world. Now, one way of thinking about this might be to think about it kind of like the Spider-Man dilemma, right? Almost every Spider-Man movie or some version of it with Marvel now lets Spider-Man either get confronted with the idea or explain some sort of an idea that if there's some evil you can prevent and you don't prevent it, that then makes you guilty of that evil happening. With great power comes great responsibility, right? Now, if that's applied to God, and He's assumed to be the all-powerful being in the world, some might ask then, and many have asked and then asserted, if He could prevent evil and He allows it, doesn't that make Him guilty of it? Doesn't it make him responsible for that evil? Here's a blog post that I read. A horrible story of great evil done to a woman. And she says this at the end. She says, "I cannot understand how people think it's a good idea to teach a helpless child that God, whose existence is entirely unproven, has the capacity to help them or save them from actual harm. I had no doubt as a child that God was real and that he would help me. And because I had faith, I suffered for a lot longer than I would have if I had known I was on my own. I wasted so much pain and suffering on faith. Children who have cancer or other terrible circumstances are no doubt praying, just as I did, for help that will never come. It is extraordinarily cruel to teach children to have faith when it is possible to teach them instead to rely on themselves and on real things." So you can understand that the woman who wrote that dealt with great tragedy, and from that great tragedy came to this conclusion: I can't worship a God who would allow unspeakable evils in his world. So the question that really comes about it is, how can a God who is good allow evil? So here's your question. Which of God's attributes, properly understood, addresses this dilemma? Heretical assertion number 2. I can't worship a God who would expect to be deified as our central focal point. In other words, I can't worship a God who is narcissistically dependent on everybody else paying attention to him. Think of it this way. We as people are encouraged to be humble. In fact, we're encouraged to be humble by God himself. But if God, as the example of our morality, as the supreme being that we're trying to aspire to be like, is saying in Scripture and is telling us, it is best for you to pay attention to me, how does that not violate what God's called us to be? If we're called to be humble, then why isn't God similarly humble by saying, oh, you don't have to pay attention to me. It's not that big a thing. I don't need your worship, and whoever you choose to worship, I'm okay with myself, and I can just, we can just sort of be at peace together. You ignoring me and me being comfortable with who I am. That's the kind of attitude you might expect among people. It's the kind of attitude you might expect in a relationship with somebody else. You'd feel kind of weirded out if they expected to be the center of your world. And yet God makes completely different claims than that, doesn't he? What God says is, I am the supreme being in all of creation, and all reality centers around me, and it's best for you to be focused on me. So the question that some might ask out of that is God so insecure, or is God so lonely as to somehow need our attention? Is that why he demands our worship? Is because there's something missing or absent in him that requires us to give him what he's lacking? So, heretical assertion number 2, I can't worship a God who would expect to be deified as our central focal point. Which of God's attributes addresses this kind of question and addresses this heretical assertion? All right, heretical assertion number 3. I can't worship a God who would mandate allegiance to an outdated conviction. Now, that may sound a little bit complicated, but if heretical assumption number 1 is, I can't worship a God whose goodness is in question, and if heretical assumption number 2 is, I can't worship a God whose sort of humility or narcissism is in question, this one sort of is a little bit more blunt. I can't worship a God who would be unpopular. I can't worship a God who holds to opinions or convictions, or who mandates that his followers have convictions and opinions that are clearly on the wrong side of history. So this could be everything from science, or more accurately, kind of a scientism, that as a philosophy says that if you can't prove it by science, it must not be true, which is, as a side point, kind of odd because science itself can't prove that. So it's sort of contradictory to its own existence. But you hear this a lot from those in a scientific community. Clearly, the Bible is nothing but, and convictions in the Bible and explanations in the Bible are nothing but explanations given to those who didn't have scientific data, who didn't have scientific discovery, who didn't have the tools to be able to observe the things that we can observe today. And simply because we can observe them better than we used to in the past, or we can explain certain scientific phenomena better than we could in the past, well, because we can do that, we no longer need the explanations that the Bible provides. So, in that regard, we say that God created the world. We have currently data that seems to contradict what people have believed in the past. Therefore, we can't worship a God who mandates that we believe that he created the world. And we make that claim simply because we can observe more about the world, or observe more about the intricacy in creation today. It's not just to scientific types of things that an assertion like this might be made. It's also true in like a lot of political ways. The truth is this. There are a lot of things that Christians have historically held, and there's very little in that category that Christians aren't being asked to apologize for today. So we hold certain conservative values, many of which are being taken apart. The belief that God, in bringing man and woman together in something that he calls marriage, that can still be held today as a value. Certainly that's the one that's the most popular today. But there are a ton of others. The question underneath that is, how could God hold such outdated points of view, and how could I possibly worship a God that calls me to hold to some of these unpopular positions? The truth is, it's really easy to say you're a believer if what you're believing in is really popular. But a lot of people would hold to this third heretical assertion that I can't worship a God who would mandate allegiance to some ostracized or outdated conviction. So the question is this: which of God's attributes address that kind of question and that kind of assertion? All right, heretical assertion number 4. I can't worship a God who would deny me, or certainly who would deny others, what we need to be truly happy. Now, to say this one as a question, how is a God who denies me good things good? Now, that may sound a bit like a juvenile kind of assertion, but I think it's a really popular one, and I think it's a really powerful one. In fact, as Americans, we all know, because our country has declared that this is true, we have the right, the inalienable right, to pursue our own happiness. And because of that, we also believe that we have the right to then evaluate those things that are not making me happy as being solely judged by whether I get happiness from them. So I want to work a certain job, or I want to work another job. One of my core reasons for choosing one job or another is whether it's going to make me happy. We don't live in a society that determines what job we work based on our duty to the greater good. We don't have some level of expressing that the reason we're motivated to do things is because we're trying to make other people happy. There's a deep inner core conviction that we should be able to be happy. We should do things because they make us happy. And the errant conclusion that comes out of that is that the things that deny me happiness can never be good. Now, it's odd. We don't believe that when it comes to physical training. We believe that there's a certain pain that brings gain. But the assertion that comes theologically here is that we can't worship a God who would deny me what I need to be happy. And so, in other words, we allow our circumstances to evaluate and to be the sole piece of evidence we have about whether or not we should worship God. So the question is, which of God's attributes address that question and contradict that heretical assertion? All right, before we get to the fifth heretical assertion, let me just congratulate you on getting this far. I'll reward you with a little article from the Babylon Bee. It's a satirical website that comes up with kind of ludicrous ideas. The trouble is these ludicrous ideas pretty often mirror what's happening in Christian circles or in political circles in the United States. But here's one of the blogs that I just read off of that, one of the posts. After reading several chapters from the Gospels over the weekend, local progressive believer Wendy Butler reportedly published a Patheos blog post in which she criticized Jesus of Nazareth for not being very Christ-like. The blog post took Jesus to task for his unloving and problematic teachings. He devotes entire sections of his sermons to ranting about archaic religious concepts like hell and the last judgment, instead of just coming alongside the marginalized and affirming their sins, Butler said. Very little of what he did on earth I would describe as life-giving. Frankly, I do a better job of being Christ-like than Christ himself. He had a few good things to say about loving our neighbors, but the bad outweighs the good in Jesus' teachings. If we're looking at things honestly here, her essay concluded, he really needed to ask himself, what would Jesus do? Now, obviously it's a satirical description of something that doesn't really exist, but it's not far off from our fifth heretical assertion, which is this. I can't worship a God who would function with motivations that are beyond my reasoning. Or, to say it a little bit more bluntly as a question, how can we adore a God that we don't really get to judge? Now, if you guys have been doing a good job as a group, or if you've been thinking through all of these different heretical assumptions or assertions, you've probably come up against this fifth one already. Because in every one of these other assertions, the broad statement we're making is that we get to evaluate God with a moral code that exists outside of God's character. In other words, we truly know what goodness is, and we need to then ask the question, is God good? We truly know what's right, and we need to ask the question of whether God, therefore, is righteous. And the problem underneath that is that even though nobody says it quite so boldly as that, our inability to comprehend what God is doing, our inability to explain God's character, or our inability to be able to describe that God is indescribable, that leaves us with a problem. God ultimately is the judge. God ultimately is the standard, and we're not. But when we think that we can evaluate God, when we come dangerously close to this heretical assertion that we can't worship a God that we can't judge first, and then instead we have to recognize, I, in coming to God, am evaluated by him. I'm not doing any evaluating. I'm probably closer to being able to worship him than I am if I hold to this assumption. Now, this assertion, this question, this final one that we'll look at, it may even spur on other thoughts. It may even spur on other heresies that you've heard or other assertions that might be true. So as you wrap up your conversation and as you think about what it means for us to truly study the attributes of God, please just remember this. God has revealed himself to us so that he can be worshiped, not so he can be judged and evaluated. Our goal in getting to know God is getting to know more about him so that we can revere him, adore him, and lay our lives before him. So, I hope this has been helpful for you guys. But as you ask this question, what attributes of God address this kind of question and prevent us from trying to function as a judge over him and over his motives, maybe you could think about some ways as well that other people are struggling up against this. And you could even think through, how could you be an effective tool of bringing the truth and bringing the knowledge of God to people that are clearly struggling up against these kinds of errors. I hope you guys have a great time talking this through, and I hope that this leaves you with some people you can be praying for and thinking about how God's using you as a tool in their lives. Have a great evening.